Hello. Welcome to Small Talk. I'm Silvia Karman Cubiñá. I'm the Executive Director of the BAS, and I'd like to welcome you to Small Talk and our conversation with Isaac Julien. So before we begin, I would like to thank Art Bridges for their generous support of Small Talks and introduce Isaac Julien. Isaac? Hi, Isaac.
Hi, Sylvie. Hi.
How are you?
Great. It's great to see you.
Wonderful to have a little chat here in our program of Small Talks that we've been doing since COVID started, just so people can see the artists that we've been working with and just have a sense of, what you're doing now and all of that. So Isaac Julien has a resume too long to even talk about, or we spent 40 minutes doing that right now. But we will mention that he is in collections and has exhibited extensively in collections including MoMA and the Rosa de la Cruz collection. The De La Cruz collection. And we would like to focus on a few works right now, the ones at the McElvoy Foundation, which is your exhibition there, which is Lessons of the Hour.
That's right.
The exhibition that you have as well at Maxi, which is the Lena Bobardi, The Marvelous Entanglement. That is the best title I've ever heard.
Thank you.
But before we begin, tell me, you are in Santa Cruz because you're professor of UC Santa Cruz. And I just read right this minute, it's the Isaac Julien Lab.
That's right, yes.
That is so cool. Tell us about that.
Well, I mean, in a way, it's just a continuation of lots of different things I've been doing over the years when I've been sort of teaching. And so it sort of accumulated in this lab here at Santa Cruz, because I've taught at Harvard, also in Germany, at the ZKM Art School, Central St. Martin's. And when I was offered, this sort of position as a distinguished professor of the arts, they said it'd be fantastic to maybe bring all of this together into a kind of lab, and then to create a new way of sort of teaching and research that dovetails into your practice and vice versa for students into their practice. And so this is what we've been doing. It's been a very exciting project here, working with fellow colleagues and professors and artists. Yeah, but of course
you've always been a professor, always. Like you're super amazing artist practice. You've been a professor, and so besides juggling, having two exhibitions right now and being at UC Santa Cruz, what have you been doing during COVID times? Any new hobbies? Anything that you're, gardening, cooking, something?
Well, gardening, of course, is something I've been very interested in doing, and I could, I won't pivot my screen to my garden just over there, but yes, but I would say that sort of, in a way, it's been a time of research, and so it's been really a sort of space for being able to also really, in a way, cut back and also think a little bit about what one's doing. And also, it's been really kind of a time for focusing on new ideas, so that's been really interesting to be able to create new projects. And I've been a little bit back to basics with collage works. And so some of the collage works ended up becoming wallpaper collage pieces at the Maxi Museum that started off from cutting things out on my kitchen table. And so it's been quite exciting. And of course it's also been quite demanding as well, because of all the various things that happened in 2020, which meant that at one point it became very demanding in relationship to both demands to show my work and and also yeah, I mean, we know that it's been a very, living here in America during this past last year, where I've been here for the whole year, has made me realize more what it's like, you know, for Americans and all of that. So it's really been very pivotal and important in a way. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, it's been a crisis. It's been a crisis year here in America and everywhere, I think. So I think when you live crisis, you feel like in 1 year you're living 5 years because you're compressing all of these thoughts and all of these, you know, moments and, you know, things that have happened this year into one. And so it feels longer in a way.
Yes. I mean, it's also gone by very quickly, but it's been just very pivotal, you know. So I think there's a way in which sort of like I've been able to, in a way, consolidate things to a certain extent and re-articulate them. And so all the demands, one's been able to meet those demands to a certain extent. And it's incredible the things that you can do in a crisis scenario. My studio has been incredible in terms of mounting exhibitions, working from an iPhone, installing exhibitions from an iPhone, you know, waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning, you know, to install a show in Rome, or, you know, 4 o'clock in the morning to install a show at the Royal Academy for their belated summer exhibition, which was a homage to Opera in Wales. And none of these exhibitions I've seen myself. I've just seen photographic reproductions of them. But nonetheless, yeah, it's incredible what one's able to do. And at the same time, you know, just this reconsolidation of what it is that you do in terms of, you know, having been forced to really rethink your practice somewhat. So, but lucky for me, I guess, that I did the completely bonkers thing of making 2 works, Lessons of the Hour and A Marvelous Entanglement, in 2018-19, and getting them both released in 2019. You know, 2020 would have been very difficult to make
timing.
those works.
I mean, that was amazing timing, almost like you were, you know, like you knew you had to hurry up and get them out and released before this. Amazing. So you and I met when you were preparing 10,000 Waves. And I remember our meeting where we were sitting and you were showing me just pieces of the work because it wasn't finished. And at that point, we agreed to do a show because I knew it was going to be amazing just by the pieces that I was seeing, but I didn't see the whole thing yet. And then you showed 10,000 Waves. It was the US premiere at the Bass. What year was that? I don't remember what year that was.
2010, Silvia.
2010. That was 10 years ago.
It was.
Wow. And now it's in the collection of MoMA, which is very, very exciting. And so I really had this wonderful experience of seeing at the end of your process and seeing sort of, you know, what it takes for you to wrap up, but not the research phase. And then I kept hearing about new research, so I kind of put it together. But before we talk about your shows, I want to ask you about your research. It's so extensive and so beautiful, the way you just kind of dive into these places and people and topics for years.
Yes, I mean, I guess in a way you could link it to kind of my own background as someone who has parents who, you know, came from the Caribbean to England, that kind of migratory kind of aesthetic, which of course is something which, you know, in my part of the world and that blighty Brexit island are all against these days. But of course, it being the centre of the empire to some extent, my relationship to it and how that expanded into, you could say, what we have today in terms of a global art sort of sensibility for me, is linked in a personal sense, so I would say that my kind of research in relationship to making my projects, has this kind of geographical aspect to it. So work like 10,000 Waves was linked to all of those very early questions of migration and how the terrible tragedy of the Chinese cockle pickers in 2004 drowned in Morecambe Bay, the north of England, and just wondering how the hell did they get there and how did this tragedy occur? And then going deep into Chinese culture and it took 4 years before I came across, the Hamazu myth. And I was able to think about this tragedy in a more allegorical sense, so it takes a long time to familiarize yourself with, Chinese culture. And I really did that through the art world, you could say, and researching the project, going to the actual location where the Chinese cockle pickers originated from, and then in a way working backwards in time, so that takes a whole team of people, and it takes a whole sort of, if you like, various interests, visual, cinematic, also newspaper reporting, and you just get everything. And then you come across people like the fantastic poet Wang Ping, who wrote the poetry for the work, that being the springboard to a certain extent into visualizing and making the imagery. So yeah, so that's like one example, and of course it continues on all the other projects.
And then the production, because you come from film, like, feature film sort of, or narrative film. Am I saying the right thing?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, you weren't always a video artist. You were doing film that was not, the type of art world, video art that we know, and much less installation art. You have this really interesting, amazing, it's sort of a fusion of the two, because you function almost like a filming company, a Hollywood filming company, with all the research and the cameras and the locations, and you exist inside the art world, which is very unique.
Well, it is. I mean, the works do cost quite a lot of money, and I probably have very expensive habits, that. But at the same time, I think there's a way in which I was just really very excited by the art world as someone who was involved in the film world but had studied art at an art school. So it was a little bit like coming back home. And I was very excited about the ways in which one was able to utilize all the kind of new technologies, video projection at that particular time, being on the eve of digital revolution, and how those became part of a kind of vocabulary of video art. And so, yeah, and then it became just too exciting to experiment with lots of different screens. And so that's where the bad habits form, so to speak, that you bring this kind of level of film production, and you bring that experimentation, which is more accepted, of course, in a gallery art context than it would be in your kind of more classical cinema setting.
And even the way you install the work in a gallery, it's very cinematic and very architectural in a way. Why don't we see some pictures of 10,000 Waves? We have some images of the show at the Bass. This was the entrance to the galleries upstairs. Isaac, you want to say something about this?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, we were forming a kind of parcours before you go into the actual work. And so it was really, really exciting, because this was the first time I'd made these kind of larger photographic works. And here we have Blue Goddess, which kind of, in a way, is based on a lot of archival research, a 1934 film, which was made in China, which was you know, a complete success, which focused on a woman who had to, in a way, become a prostitute, you know, to support her child. And this is an iconic sort of film, and what I've done is to just reconstruct it into a photographic diptych here. But it's the first time I worked at this scale. I was very excited by the new German school of photography during this time. I was teaching in Germany, and these photographic works were printed in Grieger, which is the same sort of production house that worked with all the new German photographers. And so if we go to the next slide, please. You know, this is work here, which is called Glass House. And I was very interested in the use of color. I was thinking about Richter and his use of color. So there's a kind of coming together around new German photography, but also the kind of iconography of Shizwasery and Chinese culture in Shanghai. So if you go to the next slide, please. And here we have the fantastic installation. And I would say that, you know, Silvia, when we did this installation, we worked with the curators as well as artists. And so we're also, of course, working with fantastic technicians. But I have to say that this installation of 10,000 Ways was fantastic. And I still dream about it today, this show, this exhibition at the BAS. If you go to the next slide, please. So here we have the sea, and of course the sea plays a huge role in terms of this work, because the sea is a space where, if we think about Black cultures, you know, it's very symbolic. It's a space where you have people like Dirk Walcott write his Paradise Omeros poem, essentially about the sea. He wrote a very famous poem, The Sea is History. And if we go to the slide before this one, if we go back, please, you'll see Maggie Chong plays Mazu. And what we were able to do in this work was to work with the screens as a form of navigation, where she flies through all the different screens. And so all the ideas around thinking about the mobile spectator, and thinking about those in relationship to the journeys that people are making were sutured. You know, the spectators could view from either side and look at the screens. I'm not trying to say that the terrible journeys that people make are equated in people being mobile spectators, but this question of movement and viewing became important, and I think was very much achieved in your exhibition. If we go to the next slide, please. And we go to the next one. Oh, and here we come to the Maxi.
Here we come to the present, yes. Well, let's definitely talk about Maxi. I think the show is up right now in Rome.
It is. It's just reopened, actually. Reopened last week. Of course, it's been under lockdown. Yeah, so.
Good. So this is a work called A Marvelous Entanglement on Lina Bobardi. And I'll let you explain it. Why am I going to explain it?
Well, A Marvelous Entanglement is a work which looks at the modernist architecture from Brazil, Lina Bobardi, who created a kind of revolution in architecture, along with lots of other important figures in Brazilian art. And one of the things that she did was she was really interested in trying to, I would say, revolutionize the way that the Brazilian audience at that time, after the war, were thinking about art. And with her husband, Petra Bardi, they built a museum in São Paulo called Maspi, but they also built several other museums, or I should say that she built several other museums, usually with a form of conservation of an old building and then remodifying it. So I was lucky to have an exhibition at Sesci Pompeia in 2012, and that is the building art center that she designed. And for me, it's just utopian space. It's a little bit like in London, we have a brutalist building called the Hayward Gallery. And I always say that her Sesky Museum is like a tropical Hayward. And what I did in the Maxi exhibition, because of course this is Zaha Said and Zaha's incredible museum, which had a similar parcours that you had, Sylvie. You know, I mean, you had a gangway in the Bass where I had to work with some photographic works, and this is a bit similar here. So a little bit tricky, but when I was making my collage works during the lockdown, they resulted in these wallpaper works, which are kind of on, you know, the right-hand side, and were in a way commissioned by the Maxi Museum, and the photographic works, you know, on the left. So we go to the next slide, please. So this is just a detail of two of the works, and Julien Lab worked with the organic aspect of, I would say, Brazilian culture, and translated that into her vision of a kind of Brazilian modernism. And she was able, I would say, single-handedly to really create some synergy between the sort of elements of Brazilian culture, which were kind of the organic and in some cases Afro-Brazilian sort of cultural motifs, and in some way to synthesize that into the creation of many of her architectural projects. So this cutout, for example, thinking about collage, it's like a cutout really of a brutalist kind of space onto the city. And if we go to the next slide, please. So you'll see this is something in her buildings. And then what I did was to kind of make this portrait of her, where we have Fernanda Montenegro and Fernanda Torres play mature Lina Babadi and younger Lina Babadi, who in real life are mother and daughter. So this is a very nice play in terms of time, their mother and daughter. And at the same time, in the work, we traveled to several of her buildings in Bahia, in Salvador, and also her famous buildings in São Paulo. And we make a kind of tour of the different buildings. But weave through that tour, we have these manifestos which are delivered both by our performers and a number of performances that take place in these very locations and buildings themselves. If you go to the next slide, please. So that's Lina Babadi. But Lina Babadi, you know, has been incredibly, you know, it has some connections to 10,000 Ways because of the way in which you're traveling to other locations and spaces and trying to re-articulate these histories and stories that are not always part of our, they're not in the, perhaps in the mainstream part of art discourses or our political discourses.
So lessons of the hour, do you think that is, it differs from 10,000 Waves and Marvelous Entanglement in precisely that way, that the histories are a little more compact?
Yes, because Lessons of the Hour, which is this slide is an installation view, which is the exhibition, which is now going to open very soon. It's also been under lockdown, but opens very soon, I believe next week, at the McAvoy Foundation for the Arts, is a portrait of Frederick Douglass, who was a great abolitionist and African-American orator and philosopher, you could say. And what I did in this work was really a work which I was luckily commissioned by the Memorial Art Gallery in Rochester, John Hanhart and Jonathan Binstock, who basically said to me, we'd like you to make a work on Frederick Douglass, or I should say that you know, the curatorial hand led the way, so to speak. John Hanhart led me to Frederick Douglass in Rochester to his statue. And when I heard his story, I thought, I've got to make a film about him because, you know, we need to hear about him. And so a lot of the way in which this work is made is very influenced by 10,000 Ways. Everything begins with 10,000 Ways, Silvia.
Of course, of course.
But in its presentation, it's different, but it's working with the salon hang, smaller and larger screens. And essentially, we get to hear several of his speeches. Some are about photography, the others are about human rights, you know, and against the way in which he was very much an abolitionist and struggling to free African Americans away from slavery, and also he was really someone who was at the forefront also as a kind of philosopher around photography. So here we have an image of him with, he was the most photographed man actually of the 19th century, believe it or not. And he's an incredible orator. And so I wanted to tell the kind of more transatlantic story of Douglass, because he lived in Scotland for 2 years, and a lot of his philosophy and ideas were very much interpolated by his experience living in Scotland. And he returned back to America, no longer a fugitive slave, but a free man, due to the many speeches that he gave at his time when he was actually in England. Yeah, so
what a coincidence, you know, this is such a timely topic, and you're in the middle of all of this national conversation that we've been having in the year 2020 and now 2021 about, you know, just racial inequality and many other more complicated things. And you produce this work right before it. And I'm sure that you've been brought into this conversation.
Well, yes, I mean, in a way, I have to say the response to it has been quite phenomenal, but also I think in a way the kind of timeliness of the piece really did in a way become part of what would be a national conversation about race in the United States, and dare I say also in the UK and in Europe. And so in a way, I think, you know, sometimes as artists, you are in a way a kind of, you know, barometer of cultural swings, you know, to a certain extent. And when I was making this work, it just felt that it was really important to hear what Frederick Douglass had to say today, because some of the things he said then resonate so strongly in our kind of conversation, if not contestations that have been taking place today. But, you know, the fact that he was someone who taught himself to read, that he was, when I went to his house in Washington, that, you know, he had the complete works of Shakespeare, you know, that he had his own art collection, you could say. You know, he did the grand tour, actually. And yeah, I mean, an incredible person. So for me, you know, it just became really important. I was really interested in photography, in his interest in photography, which aligned with my own interest in photography. We can go to the next slide, please. And in a way, I was able to then really think about 19th century portraiture. I made tintypes and these works, which are kind of photographic works, which are more painterly, you could say. If we go to the next slide, please. And these are all views from the exhibition at the McAvoy Foundation for the Arts. And they've done this amazing installation. And so all of that's been incredible to be able to do that at this particular time, you know, under difficult circumstances, but at the same time, it's been fantastic to foreground this sort of history, which I think, of course, is a Central American history, but also has this connection to the UK.
And you say foreground, this history, and but it's also, this work makes it that you're in the middle of this conversation, which is interesting. Have you had anybody reach out to you, or any specific conversations about this work specifically, and what's been going on in the United States and specifically, but other countries, as you mentioned, that has changed the work, or has changed the work in your mind?
Well, I have to say that I had an amazing conversation in a set of webinar programs which have been organized by McAvoy. One with Angela Davis, which was really incredible,
Wow.
sort of conversation wise. And it was incredible in terms of the things that she had to say, in terms of the fact that if we think about Douglas, we can think about her work in abolitionism and her work around prisons, but also just her work around human rights, and also that kind of long history that she represents. And also I was fascinated by the fact that she actually had been following my work since I started making films in the early 80s, and knew all the titles of my works. And so that was an extraordinary conversation. But there have been lots of different, in a way, things which have been happening here, even in Santa Cruz University, an amazing exhibition visualizing abolition, exhibition which is at the San Jose Museum, which unfortunately has not been open, but has been developed by some of my colleagues here at Santa Cruz. And I think there's been a synergy that's being developed at this particular moment in terms of questions around ecology, questions around rights, human rights, questions around race, which are part of a kind of national conversation. And so I guess I see my role as an artist as being able to think about these conversations as a form of poetic restitution, almost, or visual reparation. They're forms of visual reparation that, in a sense, start to make works which can do the kind of important work of reparation in these contexts. And I think part of that is about the possibility for creating the spaces for dialogue, and for positive discourses, and for some uncomfortable questions that need to come to the surface. That's at the same time not to lose the fact that, Douglas was someone who was a musician, that was, was really into literature, into the arts. And this was one of the fascinating things that really came out of the conversation with Angela Davis about her connection to the arts, in fact, and how that, I think, the arts creates a space for this possible reconciliatory space for these questions.
Well, it's a matter of just bringing forth these histories with your work. There is this person, and it's, as you mentioned, very complex. Bringing him forth and putting him in a museum and talking about him and showing him in a way, I think are those reparations that you're talking about. So we have a whole bunch of questions. So many questions that I don't know whether to look at my phone or where, but in with this one on my phone. Tom Healy.
Hi, Tom.
A warm hello to Mark and you, Isaac.
Hi, Tom.
And as a poet, he says, what a marvelous entanglement to have you here in Miami. The question I have, given your powerful innovations in working with moving images. I'm curious what you've been thinking about this crazy form we've been stuck with tonight. Zoom conversations, virtual engagement. Is this medium affecting your practice?
Well, of course, it's a very ironic aspect to this, you know, Tom and Sylvia, which is, of course, we're here on our multiple screens, so to speak, you know, and so you do wonder if people will ever want to look at a screen ever again, you know, once we're out of this mess. But I think it's interesting to think about, you know, that our form of communications have been, to a certain extent, extended by this technology. You know, I think maybe the future that Zoom as an algorithmic sort of aesthetic might sort of create a kind of way of us having even more smooth interchanges. But, you know, for now, we're stuck in our boxes, so to speak, and I don't know how we'll be able to unframe ourselves out of this, but I do think there's a way that, well, this has been one of the major ways of communicating. And I've been grateful to Zoom, although, yes, we do get Zoom weary, I think. Yes. But I think that, yeah, I mean, I think it's been really interesting. I think there's a way in which perhaps, you know, it's going to be part of our lives, you know, even when we don't have to do Zoom all the time, you know. So, yeah, and I think that's, you know, it's also been fascinating to see the transformation of the art world on digital platforms, and this aspect, which I think, you know, gives us the feeling of longing to be back, to have that visceral relationship to our communications and interactions, people. Precisely.
Yeah, so having meals with people is just something that I think we all want to get back to, you know, and seeing our friends. But, you know, there's also, and I'm going to kind of answer as well for you, but there's also this climate, you know, sustainability issue with Zoom. I think a lot of us have realized that maybe we can do exhibitions from afar, and maybe we can have meetings without getting on, you know, on a flight and going places. And, you know, not only is it better for our planet, but it's also a little bit better for our spirits to be a little more still. At least it has been for me. It just quiets you down a little bit so that you can think a little more about what you're doing, like right in front of you. But anyway, I'm answering your question.
No, I agree, because I think we became very hectic, didn't we?
It did.
It became really almost kind of, yeah, it became really, I mean, I think like a lot of things got mixed up in that moment. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
So question from Edwin Ramoran. How do you feel about the impact of looking for Langston today?
Well, it's an interesting question. Looking for Langston is, you know, it's over 30 years old now. So it's a work which has had an incredible kind of longevity in terms of its impact. I mean, way beyond that I would ever imagine. But I know it's a work which has been taught incredibly widely in the United States, and it has a, yeah, I mean, and we did a lot of work actually in sort of around 2016, 17, particularly with Jessica Silverman, her gallery in San Francisco, where she, in a way, combined and helped a lot of the conservation work, because there's a long story that the negatives got lost to the photographic works, and we had to reconstitute them and reconserve them, and through the aid of new technologies, both digital and analog, we were able to recreate negatives, new negatives, and that enabled us to create these rather large prints. But I had like the amazing work of Paul Ingram, my digital retoucher, who worked in a painstaking manner for several years on reconstructing the images. And we did also some conservation on the film as well. So that enabled it to have a whole new life. And we're just at the moment in conversations of it being re-released in the United States as well, for it to be available on the Criterion Film channel and things like that. So there's lots of things which we want to do with the work to make it reach a broader, even broader audience. But it's been interesting.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So yeah.
So how wide has that film gone? Has it ever been that wide, like, you know, Netflix sort of wide?
No, it hasn't been Netflix wide, but I think it's over the 30 years. I mean, so many people have spoken to me about that work and the way that it's influenced them. And even if we think about several works which have been made recently, I think there's one work that's shown in the Museum of Modern Art at the moment that even has a soundtrack from Looking for Langston, and it's all in black and white. I think her name might be Bradley. You know, that there's a work which has a lot of homage to it in an imagistic sense. So it has had this amazing influence, and which has been incredible, I think. And yeah, so it's really that kind of younger generation that are going to what they think of the work, of course. It's fascinating. Yeah.
That's always fascinating when you have younger generations sort of, it's almost like a reinterpretation of the work.
Precisely. Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
So I have a question from Rich Simpson. Who are some of the artists that inspire you today?
Wow. Well, I have to say that kind of the many artists that inspire me today, and some artists that you don't know, and it's not really until you meet them that you think, wow, they're really a fascinating artist. And I have to say that I do think that Fester Gates is a fascinating artist. You know, he's an artist that I read a lot about, that I wondered about, but when I met him at Ocwi in Werther's memorial in Munich, you know, which took place, you know, around a year and a half ago. And it was really very moving what Fester Gates did. And, you know, I had followed his work since he was in Documenta, but meeting him and then sort of thinking about his work and what he does, I was really struck by his work and him as a person. Yeah. So
he did something for the memorial?
Yeah, he sang for Ocwi Werther's memorial, and it was amazing what he did. Beautiful. Yeah, it was really, really amazing. And so, but you know, the other artists who have been always very inspiring to me, you know, artists like Glenn Ligon, you know, has been a friend, and you know, I very much admire his work. And also, I think there's a way in which that, yeah, I mean, there are also writers, which I find very inspiring, working with Celeste Barnier on Lessons of the Hour. And I think, you know, there's lots of things that you learn from making your works as well, you know. So as terrible a situation that Brazil is in today, politically, I mean, I have to say that culturally, that is an amazing country. And the creative talent and inspiring sort of artistic personas in places like Bahia are just, I mean, it's just kind of phenomenal, you know. So I was really fortunate to be able to capture some of that, I think, in the making of the Lina Bardi work. So, yeah,
and also music. I mean, I think about the music in the film, which is amazing. And how do you deal with sound? Do you work with someone?
Yeah, I work with sound. I mean, in the case of a film like Looking for Langston, I made the soundtrack a year before I shot any imagery, you know, so the sound work came first, you know, and the sound influenced the writing of the script. You know, I had approached a musician who I'd seen at a conference who wrote this song called Beautiful Black Men. And I approached him, could you write a kind of sort of homage to Langston Hughes? And he wrote the song Blues for Langston. And those two songs were recorded the whole year before we shot anything. You know, I invited him to London, Blackberry, the artist came to our studio and we did a recording, and it was on the basis of the recording that I was able to write the script, for example. And that sort of methodology is something which I've tried to apply to a lot of my work. So yeah, and that's the same. I did the same thing for 10,000 Waves, working with Jah Wobble and the Chinese dub orchestra. Yeah, so these ways of thinking about research, which can be quite costly, are ways of really trying to make that sonic contribution be a really kind of original, you know.
You know, now that you mention it, I have a couple of questions. One specifically by Maria Lino, who asked how you get your funding for your ambitious projects.
Well, that's a good question, because of course, you know, how I get my funding from my projects really is connected to both the support that I have had from my galleries, who have been incredibly generous, and I would say that I really wouldn't be able to have made my work without their support, but also patrons and collectors, you know. And so how I got to first show my work in Miami was through Rosa de la Cruz, who was introduced to me by Hans-Ulrich Obrist at the Sir John Soane Museum. This was in 1999, and she basically was interested in my work, and through the very generous invitation by Hans-Ulrich Obrist, Rosa wrote a check on the spot and gave it to me and said, there you are, make your work. And a year later, I was able to give her Vagabondia, and she installed it in her, you know, amazing house at the beginning of Miami, you know, Art Basel Miami, you know, in her home. And that was where everything started, you know. So I would say, you know, apart from the fact that that was such an incredibly generous thing that she did, the installation that she did was extraordinary. And even a work like Lessons of the Hour, in some senses, is a homage to that work. You know, it's in a red room, it's red carpet, it's red walls. And that's where I began in terms of making my work with Vagabondia. So I would say that that's been the point. Of course, those things expanded, the screens expanded. Maybe it might be time to kind of contract, you know. But certainly that's where it all began, really. And it's really through the relationship with curators, you know, such as yourself, Silvia, and others, and the way in which, you know, there's a synergy between the collectors and the galleries, where there's a real sort of interest in having this experience, this unique experience of video art, which comes into fruition, but by that support.
You know, we started our conversation talking about Miami and waves. And I think this is a great point to end our conversation, talking about Miami and Rosa de la Cruz. It just seems like a full circle.
Yeah.
And how important collectors are in the work of an artist and the work of a museum, and how they sit on boards, and their generosity and support is very important, because you talked about this moment many, many times with me. you mention it, and it was something that I think was a turning point for you.
No, it was, and still is to a certain extent, because I'm still in the scenario of these projects of always, but I mean, recently I did get some commissions, but I would say that one of the things that happened in our art world, in the kind of speed and velocity of which it was developing, which is then you could say some of the expediencies which developed in terms of, the quick glance and the kind of quickening of how we were relating to art meant, I think, there was a kind of effect of, video works and moving image works. They became less and less part of the lingua franca of the art fair, which became very narrow, So I think we're in a point now where we can have this reflection and think about sort of what it is that we really want, so to speak, what we want to see, and
what moves us.
Precisely, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Isaac. I want to appreciate you spending some time with us to chat about your exhibitions. For those of you in Rome or in, where else? Where is McAvoy?
San Francisco.
In San Francisco. For
Yes.
those of you in Rome and San Francisco, tomorrow you can go to shows and see Isaac's work. But thank you. And I also want to thank Art Bridges for your amazing support of this program. Bye.
Bye.